So here we go, GRC. Glad to be doing this. For those of you who I know this is the technical track, but if you've been sitting watching pen testing and hackers all day, we're going to take a big 180. Before we get started, this is like 50 minutes of conversation, and GRC is a very big and broad topic. So I put my LinkedIn profile there. If you have questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to me, whether that's specific to the topic, career advice, cybersecurity, whatever. I'm happy to help you guys out. So here's what we're going to go over today, right? So we'll discuss a little difference between risk versus security. We'll talk specifically about what governance, risk, and compliance is. We'll talk, and then I'm going to break it down where we'll talk about each of the individual letters, the risk, the compliance, the governance side, how we use that from an assessment and roadmap standpoint, and then kind of how it works into your career. So looking at information security holistically, I kind of look at the entire industry bubbles up into about three areas. You've got the technology side, where most people are pretty familiar with things like firewalls, and then you've got the threat and test side, where penetration testing and threat monitoring, all that stuff come into. And GRC is pretty much everything else. This is where your management comes from. This is where your paperwork side of the house really comes into play. Just so you guys know, from all of these terms, they're all the same thing as far as I'm concerned, right? There's a lot of the industry, but when I use any of these terms, they're all interchangeable. We're just talking about information security, cybersecurity, whatever we call it, as a whole. Okay, so the first thing to understand when we're talking about GRC is the difference between risk and security, right? So the pictures up here are not just for show. We look at the dragon sitting in his cave with all of his treasure. There's a risk inherent to that knight going in there and potentially being eaten or killed. And he has to weigh that risk as to whether or not he wants to decide to go in there. Is it worth his life potentially? What protective measures does he have, which comes into where the security aspect are. So in this metaphor here, security are things like his armor, his training, his weapons. Okay, that's a really clear distinction in the space that everyone should understand, that risk is potentially what could happen to you, and weighing that, and then security are actually the controls and things that you do to reduce that risk. You will see in your entire career people using those terms interchangeably, and that is incorrect, right? So really understanding the difference between those two will help you out in the long run. I'm going to keep okay. So GRC, as I said, the G is the management part. So we're talking about governing the state of risk, the state of compliance, the state of security within that organization. It's really just the way that we manage, maintain things as we continue on in business. Risk, again, the potential bad things that could happen. And then the compliance, which is simply somebody is telling us that we need to do something a certain way, and us making sure that we are doing that, right? So that's kind of the three letters broken down there. So let's talk about risk first, which I think is the most more complicated version, more complicated aspect. You'll also come in to understand and learn that there is risk. Again, the term will be used in the financial industry as well. We're financial risk, which is very different than cybersecurity risk, information security risk. They're talking about, basically you as a creditor, maybe, the risk you have for being able to pay your bills or the business going under. So make sure when you're looking at things like job descriptions, or when you're looking at requirements, that you understand the difference between financial risk and then what we're talking about, which is cybersecurity risk. So cybersecurity risk is pretty easy. It's simply how much potentially something could cost me if something bad happens, and me being the business. And when I say cost, there's a loss there. So if the bad guys get a hold of something, there's either ransomware can steal money. There can be an impact to the company's reputation where they don't sell a lot. They could lose trade secrets. They could have service impact where they're not delivering or manufacturing. There could be fines because they fall out of compliance. All of these things, basically, everything a bad guy could possibly want to do, or that an organization could, maybe not even a bad guy, just fail to do something the right way, can potentially cause loss of money. And that's when we're talking about risk. It's very quantified. And how we calculate it is fairly simple. There's the likelihood, what is the potential that this bad thing could happen, and then if that happens, what's it going to cost us, right? So as you go through a career in the GRC space and working in risk, there will be a lot of complexities that can actually get added to this as well. But essentially, you can use things like threat modeling, the information you get from threat intelligence. You can use the industry, right? So we can, like, for example, you can identify that an organization has a higher probability for phishing, which is going to increase the potential for malware. And then we know if that breach that's there, they could lose their trade secrets, and then you can actually financially quantify what could potentially happen. And the reason you do this is so that you can understand what you want to do to protect it. It's sort of like insurance on your car, right? If your car is only worth $500, it's not worth you spending $2,000 a year to insure that, right? You sort of accept that risk. Now we'll start to get into some of the letters and alphabet soup. Standpoint, just read about risk management, how to assess for it, and how to do it. Risk will also come into some other stuff we've talked about, but these are kind of the Bibles for risk. And then, as I mentioned with the insurance example, so we have a risk appetite. So this is an organization, and how basically just talking about where do they want to balance the potential bad thing and the potential cost, right? So us as risk and security professionals, it's our job to do this evaluation, to identify the potential risks and the potential impacts, and then present that to the business. The business will ultimately decide how much money they want to spend and where they want to spend that. And that spend could be in things like compensating controls. If there's a risk for data loss, they might put in data protection or improve their data protection program. They may decide to, migrate to a different platform. There's all kinds of potential things that they could do to reduce that risk. It's just a matter of how they want to spend. Okay, compliance is a little more straightforward, right? You've got regulations, laws, contracts, industrial, all this stuff here. These are basically based on your business that you work for or that you own or run or whatnot. They're going to have requirements through all these different organizations. So for example, if you process credit cards, you're going to be subject to PCI. If you're a healthcare organization, you're going to be subject to HIPAA. If you're, everybody's subject to HIPAA from a privacy standpoint. Anybody that has an HR system has to protect people's personally identifiable information, right? If you're dealing with products if you're dealing with customers who are possibly in Europe, then you're going to have data protection from GDPR, which is the EU standard. So all of these things basically just say, hey, if you want to do business with us in this region, in this industry, here's the standards we set, right? And this is really there's sets of controls and requirements. So it's simple things. For example, PCI will tell you you have to change your password every 90 days. You have to make sure that the guest Wi-Fi is segregated from the corporate Wi-Fi. You have to make sure that you train your staff on what PCI is. It's all fairly straightforward. Some of it may be a little more gray in areas, but it's essentially the organization going through and saying, yes, we're doing this, right? And what that does is it does not create security. Let's be clear about that, right? Being in compliance does not mean you are secure. You can be compliant within whatever framework necessary. That does not mean you're not going to be breached, and that does not mean that you're necessarily doing everything you should. So I'll continue to use PCI as an example, which stands for payment card industry. So looking at that, there's a requirement within PCI that says all your firewall logs have to be reviewed on a regular basis. So if you're a small business and you're assessing yourself against PCI, you can check that box and say, yep, my firewall engineer does that. And he may or may not do that. And you are technically, you are on paper compliant. But if you're not looking at those logs, if you don't do something the right way, which is to, have a system actually evaluating those, have some type of intelligence, automation, if you can, looking at that to actually make some fast and quick decisions to actually implement that security. Those are the two types of organizations you'll run across when dealing with compliance. The ones that kind of just want to check the box and move on and say, yes, I'm compliant. And then the kind that really want to take that to heart and use the intent. It's similar to, in some cases, just like a law, right? Laws are written with a certain intent, but the actual execution of them, lawyers can kind of work around all that. And then as we go through that, if you're not in compliance, there's a risk there, right? So again, looking at you want to continue, when we'll talk about the governance part next, but Being out of compliance can lead to, fines or even loss of contracts. These, when we say vendor, most organizations of any significant size that do business with somebody else are going to push down a bunch of laws and regulations. So in the military, you've got things like STIGs and DISA and all of these organizations that give you sort of, hey, here's how you need to configure and do things. And that's really all it is. It's compliance, right? They're telling you this is what we want you to do, and you need to do it, right? The impacts are just a little bit different when you're compartmentalized inside the military versus here, where a vendor can pull their contract with you, or the PCI Council could say, hey, guess what? We're not going to let you process credit cards anymore. All right, governance, which is actually the easier, I think, to understand, right? What we're really talking about is how do we manage these things? How do we manage risk? How do we manage security? How do we manage compliance? How are we managing everything long term? So we talked a little bit about, so when I say frameworks, so if we go back here, looking at all of these compliance frameworks, and then I'll talk a little bit about ISO 27001 and NIST as well. An organization will adopt at some point. A business has to have a blueprint for how they want to run things, right? So there's a set of rules essentially that says, here's how we're going to do business. And then we're going to take that and we're going to apply that to all areas of the business. And that's really all this is applying all of these requirements and regulations and then making sure on a regular basis it gets managed, right? So when we talk about governance, we're talking about the environment, making sure that the environment is configured in the way that our policies state that they should be. Having the controls in place that are required. Again, looking at organizations that have sensitive information will require that data loss prevention tools are in place. That's simply a control that has to be there, right? Then there has to be policies around, what happens, how do we deal with things, what's our incident response plan? All of these types of things have to exist, and monitoring those on a regular basis. So every time a new technology gets put in place, that it's put in place in agreement with all of our requirements within that framework that we are as an organization adopting. And we go to buy a new product from this vendor, it gets tested against our frameworks and our requirements. This is really, it's the doctrine, it's the Bible that says this is how the organization is going to run. And there's a ton of people who spend their days just making sure that things continue to stay aligned and governed. So how do we do that, right? So how do we do that? Pretty straightforward. We're going to take an idea. We're going to get an idea of where we are, right? So we're going to, if you're very common in my field on the consulting side of the house, any new CISO that takes takes a new job, one of the first things he's going to do is conduct a risk assessment or a security assessment of some type to understand what their current state is. All of these different frameworks that we kind of talked, grazed on here are simply, again, ways for us to understand what we should be doing so that we can work against that. So when we look at understand the current state, we literally do an assessment. We go down, we choose one of these frameworks that we want to use or our custom framework, and we assess the organization. We interview people to ask them, how they're doing business processes. We identify how data is flowing through the organization and the appropriate controls in there. Does it align with our framework? What this does is this gives us we get a complete set of here is how the current organization looks. And then we compare that to the framework that we've adopted, or in a compliance standpoint, if we're doing, are we compliant? Where areas are we not compliant? And then from a risk standpoint, which I'll talk about in the next slide, a little more detail, where does our risk sit within these things? What happens is you basically get a point from where you are and where you want to be, and then you define that end state, and that gives us a roadmap. So every executive in security is working against some type of roadmap or risk register. They have a list of things that says, here's the stuff that we want to do over the next 6 months, 18 months, 24 months, whatever it is. Here's what it's going to cost us. And then continually managing and monitoring that to make adjustments as need be. So a couple of examples here as we look through, these are just, so this here is your NIST CSF categories, right? Sort of the way that they group stuff together. There's stuff that works in being able to identify problems, being able to protect the risk, being able to detect it, respond, and recover. These are all, this is just one framework's way of doing it, right? ISO uses the plan, do, check, act scenario, and then they also have all of these domains. So they'll break things out like access controls, asset management, and they'll work through all of these specific technical areas where there'll be lots of questions and requirements within that. This is just an example, and again, every organization can be a little different, just to kind of give you guys an idea and understand sort of how these frameworks and how the professionals are looking at this today.
We got a couple questions here.
Sure.
If I can slide them in here. I'm going to go most recent. Have you ever successfully non-concurred to DISA? From
That
Steve.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't personally work in the federal space. So when I left the Marine Corps in 2007, I left the federal space behind.
All right. And Patrick wanted to know, isn't GDPR still pretty vague on its requirements?
It is. It's. I wouldn't say it's too vague. It's pretty clear. I think their requirements exist to say what needs to be done. They don't necessarily dictate how to do it. So if I compare it to PCI, PCI is very specific and granular about how they do things. GDPR says if a European citizen tells you, hey, I want you to delete all of my data, you have to be able to do that. You have to be able to prove it. It says if you are going to take personal information from an individual, you have to tell them what you're going to do with it and who to contact in case they want to get rid of it, right? So they're not dictating that, the way that you take it or how you take it or what you do with it, other than it needs to be protected and encrypted in some type of way, but rather the processes that you need to be able to respond to this. So they're still kind of leaving it up to that. And in California is very similar.
Cool. I think that's a pretty good explanation. Thanks.
Any other ones there, Sarah?
Not yet. I'm sure we will.
Okay. And guys, I'm kind of flying through this actually. So
if you want to if there are any kind of transition points between your slides, give me like a little breath of pause there. I can jump in if there are any questions. Otherwise, keep on trucking.
Yeah, sure thing. I think we're actually just about done here. I don't want to. So let's so we'll go back here, right? So we have the doing an assessment to understand how to design to get to your end state and manage your roadmap, right? Now let's talk about maturity modeling a little bit. So maturity modeling is where we're going to, and there's different ways to do this. So the example I have here is my preferred method, the one I think is a little more valuable, which is basically saying, hey, for this aspect of information security, right? So if you're looking at ISO, they'll have access controls or operational security, things like that. For other areas, you may have different categories, but basically, it's a matter of within that category or within that specific control requirement, whatever it is, does it exist? Is it even there? Is it built up a little bit? Is it fully optimized? So this is kind of a maturity level of how something inside the organization is actually working in its current state, right? So I make a joke all the time that there's three ways everything is done within an organization. There's the way that it's documented, and then there's the way that management thinks it's done, and then there's the way that it's actually done. And those three ways are usually very different, right? Because it's usually documented the way it's supposed to be done, or maybe a little quasi. Management usually thinks it's done differently because they're not usually doing it. And then there's the people who actually execute the task and the projects and the programs and all that tell you how it's really done, right? So a little joking side note there. But what happens when you conduct these assessments is you'll identify where they are in the organization, right? Or how mature a set or group or item is, and then you place it here in a rating. There's different ways to rate it. I won't get into all that. And then it just gets really complicated. But basically, you can know, hey, as an organization, we're a 2.5, for this one idea. And then a lot of organizations will look at where the industry itself is, right? So you'll see organizations say, hey, as the most of the people in your industry are at a 3.5, right? So you're kind of behind the power curve. Now, in order to do that, the organization doing the assessment has to have that industry data to be able to do it. If they don't, that's fine, because you can use sort of risk as another guideline, right? So if you don't know where the industry is, you can kind of look at this control and say, well, this isn't exactly where we need to be. we want to be better than that, but we don't need to be a 5, right? We think if we do a 4.5, that's going to comfortably manage our, financial risk and our potential impact right there. So then you go ahead and define this end state, right? So what happens is, there's certain things to get you from this sort of, immature state to a more mature state. And that's essentially, you have things to do, right? This is your roadmap. So similar to what we just talked about, from a compliance standpoint, it's pretty easy to look at something that says, hey, your organization needs to, you need to change passwords every 90 days. If you do that, then you're compliant. If you don't, then you need to, go and make the changes in the systems that are required to do that. And that's essentially what you're doing here. You're just looking at something at a more mature path. So this is a little bigger and broader. What these things are is, again, there's technology that potentially has to be implemented. There's policies that have to be documented. You might have to train staff. You might have to just improve or mature processes. You might have to improve, and kind of going back to that firewall monitoring perspective, maybe, if somebody is manually looking at logs, that's not a very mature way to do it. And there's a chance things are going to split. So if you want to kind of get to a advanced level and you want to get a little higher rating in the maturity scale, you want to do something a little more, more intelligent, a little more proactive, right? And then essentially all of these things come together to create what is your roadmap. So, and then you'll identify within there what projects need to be done, the type of skills you need to be working with, all of that kind of stuff, right? So those are the two ways we get to a roadmap, working through either, some type of maturity level, or just looking at, hey, what specifically are the gaps we have with our framework saying we need to do business this way, we need to do business. Some natural pause there. All right, folks, questions?
We're good. We're just waxing about how we love OODA loops. That's all.
Yeah, so it's funny. There's other, OODA loop and plan do act is all, they're very similar. The difference is you don't want to get outside of the loop on security like you do against the enemy. Right?
Yeah, and I think people give a lot of those frameworks like a hard time. What's the purpose? And I love them personally, especially former military. I think a lot of us have that in common, is having that prescribed plan and framework to kind of guide our actions there.
Yeah, and I don't know. So being a Marine, we had SMEAC or OSMEAC, and when you transition, you realize that's just project management, right? You understand that, and then kind of going into security, it's a similar thing. It's a matter of making sure that we have a plan to do something from the beginning and understanding what the goal and the endpoint is. And I actually, sorry, a few minutes. I actually did a short article on the military leverages decentralized authority very well. In making sure that everybody understands the mission, so that if there's a break in the line, everybody still knows what has to get done, right? And in the corporate world, that doesn't always happen. So having this type of information, as far as when you're doing assessments or when you're responsible for managing a program, making sure that's something that we as leaders can make sure that our individuals know, hey, if something doesn't go the way it's planned, you still know the end goal, like figure out the workaround, get it done.
Yeah, and Chris is agreeing. He says he's kind of lost in a civilian job because there's no plan for advancement or skill upgrades, and I think we kind of take that for granted, is that whole concept of know what your boss does and what your junior does, so that there's no break in continuity there. So yeah.
Yeah, you guys will find there's what did we call them? I can't remember. But you have to. Everybody has this binder that, like, if you get killed, somebody just picks this binder up and then they know how to do my job. That doesn't exist in the civilian world.
And as an Air Force person, I love a checklist. I'm a big fan, and I always foot stomp that so much. And what's the title of your article? I'm gonna Google it and drop it in our chat here so we can all check it out.
If you pull up my LinkedIn profile, I think I posted it there, so you can just see my articles posted. So there's one on decentralized authority. I think that's
all right, for sure. I'm gonna Google that, drop it in the chat, and we'll include it when we post the recordings too. Proceed, sir. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, no, it's great. Yeah, and that's the thing. I'll tell you guys, I got like 12 or 13 slides. I'm used to these being very interactive, but I'm also quick to talk. So let's talk a little bit about how we apply this stuff. Well, you know what, let me pause real quick because the next couple of slides are really just sort of talking about the career itself and how you kind of work through it and what you guys can expect. Are there any other questions specific to, you know, the GRC, you know, the frameworks, sort of what it is? I mean, it's really high level, you know, but if you guys have specific questions on that, I'd like to answer those before we move in.
Any questions, anyone? Drop them in chat. How do we convince people that our risk management built into our military career and the things we've done apply to GRC to leverage for an entry-level gig? That's a great question, Patrick.
Yeah, so that is outstanding. So I'll tell you what, my last duty station, I worked for a CBRN unit, so a chemical biological response force outside of Washington, D.C. So I was basically in a first responder unit as an IT, you know, comm guy also. But having done that, I saw what happens when a disaster happens. We've seen, most of us, if you've been in any type of situation like that, you've seen how people react when shit goes sideways, right? You understand the impact of not just, you know, the security, but also the physical security. Actually, one thing we all have a big advantage on that, understanding how that works. But understanding how people, you know, how people are going to react when bad things happen is very valuable. So I translate a lot of that to business continuity, because, you know, organizations looking at how they can be resilient in the event of an incident, from a, whether it be a disaster or a hack, you know, knowing how their people are going to react, that's a big one. Then there's definitely, and this is a longer conversation, and you guys are more than welcome to message me and talk to me about it long term. I'll help you, you know, kind of reword things. There's a ton of information, or there's a ton of knowledge that we have from our military experience that applies directly to being, you know, as a, you know, the ability to take something like SMEAC and then translate it into having a plan, to be able to understand risk, right? So most of us all went through being told how to be a hard target, right? Those are all concepts that translate very well into security, and you guys just have to realize kind of how to position them, specifically when like you're interviewing, and we're kind of going off the humanities side. You know, a lot of things, a lot of times you'll be asked, when have you done this? And it'll be a specific question that you haven't, because in the military we don't do that. And the way you answer that is go, well, here's how I would deal with that. And then you give them the information that you have from your experience, and then translate it into. So a little fuzzy, but I think there's some good stuff that we can help work out there. But there's definitely a lot of things that we've done from a security standpoint that do really directly translate. If you just need a little, you kind of just need it, like somebody like me potentially that's a translator that can kind of say, oh, here's what the business wants you to say about having that knowledge.
Yeah, I might have to hit you up, because I know I definitely have a little bit of a challenge communicating the transferability of our military knowledge to that corporate world.
Yeah, I'm happy to help. But I can tell you the biggest challenge you guys face also is, well, and I face it, recruiting in the civilian world, well, just recruiting in general, you know, for jobs is terrible. The people that do it are ill-equipped. The processes they use are ill mannered. It's, you know, there's a lot of tricks of the trade. I consider myself almost a professional job hunter, even though I've only had a few jobs, because I'm continually helping people, you know, understand how they have to get into the space, the right things they need to say to get past the HR person. So absolutely hit me up for the career guidance. I'm happy to help you guys transition.
Job hunting is a full-time job in itself sometimes.
Yeah. As somebody who just spent nearly 3 months unemployed, I just took another job. That's how long it took me, with 20 years experience and all my skill. Not that I couldn't just get a job the next day, but getting the right job, right? Getting the right one and getting people to understand what your value is. It takes time and effort. I worked harder, maybe, you know, I worked harder doing that than I did when I had a job. My
Oh
job
yeah.
was easy compared to the job hunting.
Oh yeah, I'm busting my ass right now, let me tell you.
All right, guys. So let's get talk. Speaking of that, I'll give you kind of some insight here, and then I would love some specific questions, right? But as you're transitioning out, there's going to be several things that you have opportunities kind of abound everywhere, right? The federal space is usually pretty common. for a lot of foreign military to go to. It's somewhat familiar. I will tell you, in the federal space, it is very specialized, right? So if you get a job in the federal space, you will likely spend your entire career there. And that's just because it's similar to being in the military. There's a lot of lingo, there's certain ways to do stuff, but everybody outside it just doesn't understand it, right? You're still you're still going to use your clearance, all that stuff. I had a TSSCI. As soon as I, left and it expired, I never used it again because I didn't work in that federal space. So not good or bad, just something to think about as you look. I always tell people to think about the career they want to have, and then build backwards from that. So again, maybe your job isn't giving you that plan that you're asking for. I think somebody asked earlier, but make one for yourself, right? And then figure out how that goes. So looking in the federal space again, it's pretty typical transition for military. It's also very different. The public sector, a little less specialized. You will see people kind of going out of public sector into consulting, maybe into regular jobs. There's not as many acronyms, I guess is the way to put it, within the public. And when I'm saying public sector, state, local government, a lot of times education, right? Those types of jobs, a little less specialized in the federal side. The consulting side, so there's big four. So when I say big four, that's kind of a general term that gives you your KPMGs, your Ernst & Youngs, your Accentures, your HPEs. It's really IBMs, all the Cognizant, all of these really big companies that have thousands, like tens of thousands of employees. They have great opportunity for you to grow. There's a lot of entry-level positions, and maybe even some mid-level, depending on your experience. They're very used to, hiring a bunch of college kids and loading up the bus. They're usually very veteran friendly as well. And it gives you that career growth you need. It is a very corporate culture though. And then in information security, most of the time, especially if we're looking in the GRC path, you're going to be traveling a lot. Now, for most of us in the military, that's either no problem or a huge problem. Because if we're getting out and that has something to do with it, we might not want to travel, or we may be completely used to it. But you can spend a lot of time going and getting exposed to all these different businesses, because you'll be the auditor. You'll be the one going through and asking the questions on how they're doing things. Are they doing them in the proper manner? You'll be, potentially advising them on direction to take and how to run their business from a security standpoint. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And you can do that also in the non-big four. So like I've worked for smaller consulting firms. There's opportunity there too. It just depends on what you want. And that's probably a little longer conversation between you and some other people that, do you want to work at a big company or a small company? There's advantages to both. And then obviously the transition between that, once you're into consulting or going to the private sector and then back and forth, is pretty common, right? That knowledge that you're going to gain is pretty transferable. And that's kind of where I say federal is very specialized. If you spend 15 years in the federal space doing information security, and then you decide to get out, you're gonna, the general stuff is going to be there, but you may find yourself in a different world, right? So that's kind of the way I would put it. From a private sector standpoint, you've got your typical enterprise businesses. So your retail, logistics, technology companies, services companies, all of these, they're all going to be very similar. You can hop back and forth between different ones as you progress through your career. You'll see most security professionals, don't spend a lot of time at one company anymore. They tend to move every, 18 months to 3 years. That's common and accepted at this point. A lot of that is looking for that next opportunity, or looking for that pay raise, or just, wanting to work for a better organization. We are highly in demand. So we kind of get to write our own ticket a lot of times. Within those enterprise businesses, so there are a few things that I called out here. So the financial side of the house, again, because there's things like risk management on finance, and then the banking industry and the federal regulations around that, and things like publicly traded organizations and stuff like that. Those all get pretty specialized and highly skilled, or not highly, you get specialized down sort of that path. And it's a path you can continue to grow on. And again, it's still transferable, but it's definitely a world that like you can just kind of become a part of. The provider space or the healthcare space, and so providers, health hospitals and doctors and things like that, and insurers are highly specialized, right? So when we look at, I go back to all of those different compliance frameworks that we talked about. PCI is going to apply to a lot of these, even the federal to some space, right? But HIPAA and high trust, which are the healthcare ones specifically, are just in healthcare, and they're very big, they're very robust. And people who live in that space live and breathe that space all the time. That's their life, right? So again, that's just an area. So if there's an area you're thinking of working in, that's where I kind of say you could start to look at the different frameworks and use that to help build your knowledge. If you're just generally kind of wanting to get an understanding, the NIST CSF, which is the cybersecurity framework, is really the easiest one to kind of look at and digest, and it applies to everybody. And then the ISO 27001 and 27002 series, those again are very common. You can kind of apply those to everybody. If you can kind of look through those, and it's just like reading a technical manual, honestly. In fact, it's kind of worse sometimes. The NIST documents are pretty robust, with lousy with unnecessary information. So keep on going here. So from a manufacturing side, their OT is operational technology. So your factory shop floors, your oil rigs, your pipelines, all of these organizations, they have two sides of the house, right? So if you get a job on the enterprise side, where you're dealing with the regular IT people and finance people and all that, it's just kind of like being up here in the enterprise space. If you're dealing on the OT side, there's some specialization. There's some really cool stuff going on in that industry right now. 5-6 years ago, I couldn't sell security to anybody dealing with the shop floor. Now there's a ton of products out there that are supporting it. It's a big deal. And looking at risk and managing risk there is becoming very needed. I mean, if you think about what you can do, if I can hack into a manufacturing facility and overpressure some gauges and make some things blow up, nuclear facilities, I mean, there's a lot of potential risks there. So there's some cool and exciting things going on there. And then I mentioned utility, which kind of goes in the energy there a little slightly. And then pharmaceuticals, there's, again, depending on if you're on they're going to typically have an enterprise side versus the FDA side, where they have testing systems, and there's a little more knowledge there. But these are the kind of ones that I know specifically to be a little more specialized and have some specific knowledge in them. So I'll leave that and then see if you guys have questions before we go into the last part.
No questions just yet.
Outstanding. Okay. So this is your career path, right? And this is the last slide. So this is depending on where you're at now, whether you have no experience whatsoever and you just want to get started, or maybe you were already an analyst in the military and you've got all that knowledge, some of the knowledge there. Going back to saying, hey, I definitely consider the fact that I had to use a STIG to configure a BlackBerry server. I'm dating myself. That is a GRC thing, right? Somebody gave me a list of requirements and I had to configure the server to work that way, right? That's definitely GRC experience, right? So, your junior analysts and your analysts alike, this is just a matter of seniority. You're going to be spending time, writing security policies. Hey, here's how we're going to configure the firewalls, and here's how we're going to, educate people, and these are the types of stuff that we're going to do and not do, and background checks. I mean, all kinds, just literally just writing documents. Then you're going to be doing both from sort of the consulting side, where you're helping organizations, or the auditor side, right? As well as within an organization, whether you're doing these assessments internally. Those are usually the analysts and junior analysts are usually the ones sitting down talking to the business to validate that, right? So you're having conversations to say, okay, do you change your passwords every 90 days? Great. All right. Now go, turn up Active Directory and show me where that's in there, depending on the level of detail you want. You're basically just auditing and assessing that organization. And then you're going to take all that information, you're going to write reports. You're going to be doing a lot of research. So new things may come up that these guys up here on the top don't have as much knowledge about, or new client or your boss is like, hey, we need to look at this new technology, let's talk about a zero trust model, do some research, right? You'll be spending a lot of time on that. Controls and policy validation, which I just mentioned, is really just verifying that the information is accurate. Once you're up to the senior positions, this is where a lot of times you'll own projects. A lot of times you'll have a part in that budget, whether that is we going back to the roadmap that says, hey, here's the 15 things we want to do. This director up here is going to be in charge of one area, and he's going to have 3 or 4 of those projects he has to do, and he's going to assign those out, and then you're going to be working with the management to say, okay, here's the technical tasks we have to do to change this, right? And so that's kind of where you'll have the influence from budgeting, kind of understanding what the level of effort is going to be, what the cost for this technology or to build out these processes, all that stuff. So you'll be a little more involved in the building and planning of things. You'll be doing quality, assurance, quality control against the lower folks here. And then the assessments, again, you'll still be in that, question area, interviewing, conducting assessments. You'll be working with the roadmaps a little bit more. So again, that's kind of where it comes back to these different projects. So not just, identifying what projects need to be done and then, helping cost those out, but also then when the project gets approved, you'll be the one managing it a lot of times. You'll be the one driving that. Or you'll be the lead technical person or the lead GRC person for that area, right? And then obviously mentoring, right? Mentoring, and that kind of goes all the way through here. Once you're up in the management position, then you're going to have, typically, then these guys are all reporting to you. You're going to be starting talking the business. This is where you start to understand, and I didn't hit on this too much, but risk is absolutely a business conversation. So there was this, a long time ago, everything was IT security. But it is absolutely not just IT's problem, right? So if we look at things like data privacy today, GDPR, that involves the legal organization, that involves your PR organization, that involves every business unit. So HR is taking in this personal data. You've got to sit down with HR and ask them, all right, how do you take in resumes? What do you do with the data? Is that encrypted? Are we doing the right thing with it? What happens if somebody wants us to delete it? So there's a lot of understanding in business process that is really relevant in information security. And then as you get up into the ranks, you're going to spend a lot more time having business conversations based on your security knowledge. And then at this point, you'll start talking more and more to the executives. So again, to the VP suite and above, the board, you're going to be involved in helping the directors and VPs get stuff together. You're going to may even own the entire roadmap for your practice area, whatever it is you have, or business unit, and then again, always quality control all the way through there. At the director level, now you've got similar things, more responsibilities, but again, now you're spending more time on the business, more time in the executive role. Now you're worried about how well is my team performing? Are they hitting the metrics that they need to? Are we reducing our risks? Have we limited the amount of bad things happening, and how can I prove that? What's my P&L? Are we profitable? All this stuff, right? So, and I mention this because my last duty station, I worked in a very small room with thick doors, me and one other guy from SAIC, and he went to work every day, and he was a network administrator, and he was happy doing that. So he's kind of sitting around here somewhere, and that's fine. And I God bless him for it. I couldn't do that. I'm the kind of person who continues to look up and is always wanting more. But some people get really happy in a certain position, and that's fine. Understanding as you grow, there's different skill sets that are going to have to be there. And this kind of gives you guys an understanding of what you may want to pursue and kind of how to go about things within your career, right? So that's what happens there from the director standpoint. And then obviously once you're at the VP and the C level, you're in charge, you own everything. You're the one talking to the board about why they need to be doing security and whatnot. You're the one that needs to be taking the metrics that your directors are giving you and presenting them. You own the strategy, the roadmap, all the planning, a lot of times the decision making, big head honcho. It's pretty obvious stuff. Okay, guys and gals, that's a little early for me, but that's all I have for you. If there are other specific questions, got about 15 minutes. I will answer anything you want, really.
No questions so far. We're just talking about how we're all masochists, especially in GRC and cybersecurity specifically. All right, Patrick wants to know, would you say that working in crypto with all of the regulations would be a good guide for GRC as well, or preparing programs for audits like AMMT or NAVAIR audits?
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. That's good resume content, right? Being able to you've dealt with auditors essentially, right? So if you translate that to the business side of the house, if you work in any type of organization, you're going to have an auditor show up, and they're gonna come audit you, whether it's a vendor of yours that requires it, whether it's um,
whatever that you have to do. Well, are you guys there?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I have my Bluetooth.
and I think we're coming back here. Okay, yeah. So so again, that works out perfectly because you're going to have that experience where you're dealing with the auditors. In fact, anybody who ever done a GC, CG uh, for what the hell they call them, inspection. That's the same thing, right? You've got to get all of your ducks in a row. You've got to have all your equipment ready. You've got to have everything, because when the auditors are showing up, they're going to be asking for evidence. They're going to be asking for all the details, and you're going to have it all ready ahead of time. So that is definitely something that is relevant to GRC. And if you think about anything where you're managing or dealing with any type of checklist, honestly, you can kind of equate it.
All right. Edward wants to know, what are your thoughts on cybersecurity insurance?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The cybersecurity insurance is changing this aspect a lot. All right, as I build everything, I go back to how we calculate risk. So what's happening here is the risk appetite a lot of times is getting pushed. We talk about risk transference. So if something is potentially going to happen, and you can either accept the risk, which means, hey, if it happens, it happens, or you can do something to prevent it, spend some money to prevent it, or you can transfer that risk. So a lot of times they're transferring that risk to cybersecurity insurance. It's still a fairly new space, and there's some challenges around it in the fact that so having it can give someone a false sense of security, like, oh, if we get breached, they're going to take care of it all, right? But they don't always, organizations don't always read all of the fine print necessarily to understand how that works. And from a consulting perspective, from the opposite side, from like the auditor side of the house, there's potential risks too. So you see organizations now getting sued because there was a breach, and so what it's done is it's kind of created some legal it's created extra legal pipeline revenue stream. Basically, it's the way I would look at it, right? So the intention is good. It's like, hey, we're doing everything we can, and just in case something happens, this insurance firm is going to give us some of our money back. In theory, it's good, but what it's really doing is now the insurance companies are looking for someone else to blame and get the money from. So I actually have a guy I work for who he runs a team at an insurance company, and what they do is they assess the organization. So they do it the right way. So if you have a business and you want to get cybersecurity insurance from him, his team comes out and they will do all of this risk assessment, and then they will come back. It's just like if you have a lot of speeding tickets, your insurance costs more. If you have a lot of accidents, your insurance costs more. So if your risk management or your risk assessment comes back all crappy, guess what? It's going to cost more.
Yeah, so I kind of had a question in that vein. Is an insurance company of that nature going to dictate best practices to you to kind of cover their asses? Is that a thing that happens?
Yeah, absolutely. That's where it comes from. So they'll do this assessment and they'll say, okay, we'll insure you after you do these 15, 20 things, right? You can't just they're not going to just insure you if you're super high risk and you're not doing even the basic things you have to, then they just won't insure you, right? They're going to make sure, they're going to kind of drive your risk program a little bit. And a lot of them too are getting in bed with incident response, because that's something you really need to have also. If you get a breach, something happens, you need to have a retainer in place before it happens. So it's incident response is like a plunger. You should have one before you need it, right? So a lot of them will have those own services too available, and they'll be like and kind of force you to sign up with those. So there's definitely a lot of that, them driving what, if you want to have this insurance, what it's gonna, what you're gonna have to do.
I'd be interested to find out how many companies think they have that insurance, and then because they missed a step, that when they went to file a claim, they're shit out of luck because they didn't check some boxes.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's the when we talk about like, it's essentially compliance, right? So they're going to say, here's the way you have to do everything. They come and assess you and they check all the boxes, but that's a point in time. If they walk away and all of a sudden, you implemented a new technology that added risk to you, and then you get breached, they're going to come back in, they're going to do it. They're going to re-audit, and they're going to find, oh, well, you guys did this, you're at fault. And then you're not going to get your money, right? So
Man, that would suck. That would suck. Well, again, it is technically a lunch break, but of course, if anyone else has any more questions, if you got to get out of here, Will, of course, that's understandable.
I have time as long as people have questions. I don't want to take it.
Does anyone else have any more questions? I know Patrick and I are kind of nerd out about GRC sometimes. To the defect, zoom, zoom. Anyone? No? Do you have any experience in CMMC or that rollout at all?
Yeah, I helped develop it at my last company. It's the thing about CMMC is, so if you look at, actually, this is good if you don't mind me keeping talking. You guys need to leave. Go ahead and leave.
Oh yeah, I don't mind. I'm holding it down.
If you look at this maturity model, right? So this is the typical maturity model that you can grow over time. So you can say, we're a 2.5 today. We're going to be a 3 in 6 months, and then in 2 years we're going to be here, and you can kind of grow that, right? CMMC does not work that way. CMMC has 5 levels, but if you want to be a 5, you have to assess against a 5, because there are things in here that are not in all the other ones. So basically, it's very much a level and not a maturity, not necessarily a maturity model. So it's like, at level 1, you're kind of doing the basic things, and that's okay, that's fine. And then at a level 1, you're allowed to bid on ones that require only level 1, right? So if you have any intent to be a level 5 or bid on those opportunities that are going to have a level 5 requirement, then you have to assess against a 5 right?
For sure, for sure.
And they haven't at this point. I don't think they haven't identified who the assessors are going to, the auditors are going to be, but anybody in sort of the consulting space that has clients, like we did some readiness assessments for it, right? And again, it kind of goes back. I didn't really touch on this too much, but I mentioned if you're getting into this, especially coming into the civilian world, looking at NIST, CSF, NIST 800, and ISO 27000. If you look at those 3, anything else that ever comes out is almost always going to point back to it, right?
I'm noticing that. I'm noticing that for sure.
Yeah, if you look, when NIST CSF came out several years ago, well, I guess it's Obama administration actually. When it came out, we had a bunch of clients like saying, hey, this came out, we want to do this. And I looked at it, and all it really does is point you to different areas of the 800 series or the ISO series. But it makes it's kind of easier to do. So we had a lot of like manufacturing organizations who were behind the power curve in security anyway, because it made it seem easier and more digestible.